So I'm your host, Akanksha, and Asani is also in the Zoom meeting at the moment, who is our co-facilitator. The research room is produced by MAPS Canada, a volunteer-run nonprofit charitable organization committed to expanding access to safe and legal psychedelics through research, education, and policy and advocacy. The MAPS Canada Research Room is a monthly online program that highlights cutting-edge Canadian research and researchers from a range of disciplines within the growing field of psychedelic studies. The research room offers a platform for researchers to actively engage with the audience about their current work. So thank you everyone who has already joined us for joining us today. And thanks Lianna and Sheldomar for agreeing to present for us. This month is Equity Month at MAPS Canada, and we are thrilled to have Dr. Lianna Tullis-Robinson and Sheldomar Elliott with us to present their research. So Lianna is a doctoral student in counseling psychology at Western Michigan University and a certified therapist in psychedelic therapies and integration. Her work bridges compassion-focused cognitive therapy and culturally responsive approaches within psychedelic research and clinical settings. She's the first doctoral student at WMU to embed psychedelics into her dissertation, focused on optimizing therapeutic protocols for BIPOC communities. Sheldomar is a dedicated food justice leader and racial equity advocate based in Toronto. Currently serving as the Food RX coordinator and racial equity coordinator at Future Toronto, he brings years of hands-on experience tackling food insecurity and advancing food sovereignty for Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized communities. So welcome, both of you for joining us today. We'll just get started with the presentation whenever you're ready.
Certainly. Let me bring that up for you all. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you, Akanksha. And thank you to everybody else who's here joining us today. Sheldomar and I are very passionate about this research, so we're always happy to spread the word, share more information, and to connect with other folks who are in the psychedelic field. So I guess maybe I'll just briefly say again, yes, my name is Lianna Tullis-Robinson, doctoral student at Western Michigan University. I am actually not from Canada, but I am visiting Canada as a visiting research student as a part of this research project. So I am a research assistant at Dr. Monica Williams's Center for Culture and Mental Health Disparities. So that's her research lab. And then I'm also working on my dissertation that focuses on BIPOC perceptions of psychedelic therapy. So Sheldomar and I have a lot of crossover in terms of our interests and the populations who we serve. So I'll briefly pass it over to Sheldomar. Do you want to do a brief intro too?
Of course, yeah. Thank you, Liana. Thank you, Akanksha. Hi, everybody. Sheldomar here. I use he, him pronouns. Really happy to be here. As we'll talk a little bit about in the presentation, I am very embedded in food justice and Black food sovereignty work in the city of Toronto, but I'm also completing my master's in psychedelics and consciousness studies at the University of Ottawa. That is sort of what has led me to being a part of this research and still trying to find the ways to align my interests with equity and justice and community with psychedelics, hence this research project. So happy to be here, and yeah, we'll get things started.
Awesome. So today, Sheldomar and I will be presenting Building a History, Unethical Research for Mind Control. So we'll be talking about some studies that many people have not heard of that happened during the first wave of psychedelics. And a lot of this research that we'll be presenting today was very unethical. So we'll be reviewing that with you as well, and then opening up at the end for some more conversation after we discuss our research project as well. So to give a little bit of background as to how we came about or how we, in a way, inherited this research project. In 2019, our project lead, Dr. Monica Williams, facilitated a two-part workshop at an MDMA conference in Louisville, Kentucky. So the two-part workshop that she facilitated was for therapists in communities of color, hence why she was leading it in Louisville, Kentucky. And it focused on psychedelic medicine and racial trauma, right? So the intersection between the psychedelic medicines being a form of treatment for racial trauma, as well as an overview of MDMA training for these clinicians. But there was a little bit of a snag that happened. So it turns out that at this two-part workshop, there was an overrepresentation of clinicians who were white and barely any people of color or as clinicians or as attendees showed up to this workshop. So of course that ended up getting, Dr. Monica Williams and Dana Strauss and other colleagues thinking, why was this taking place? Like, where were the people of color? So they ended up engaging in some more on the ground conversations that suggested that folks in the Louisville and then also in the Lexington area and community, they were not interested in joining these workshops because they actually recalled abusive drug studies that happened decades earlier that actually left a painful and long-lasting effect on them and or on their community. So this prompted Dr. Williams, Dana Strauss, and other colleagues in 2022 to really investigate what were these research abuses, what actually happened. And through these on-the-ground conversations, they were able to actually identify and focalize or localize a specific center. So this is the Addictions Research Center, also known as ARC, that is located in Lexington community. And they found out that from the 1940s to the 1970s, they uncovered several unethical and brutal experiments that happened at this center. And unfortunately, these experiments targeted vulnerable populations, such as inmates and inpatients. So let's talk a little bit about what the Addiction Research Center is, okay? So again, located in Lexington, Kentucky. So the Addictions Research Center was located at the Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. And it ended up serving as a prominent institution that was involved in early psychedelic research, again, during the first wave of psychedelics. And in particular, this research center was known for being a major site for human experimentation. So the Addictions Research Center was one of the major sites that experimented with psychedelic drugs, such as LSD, as well as other forms of drugs such as opiates and amphetamines. So it was reportedly established with CIA involvement, so that's how they received the funding for these studies. And so essentially we're saying we think that these studies are potentially linked to the MK Ultra program. Something else that we want to point out about the Addictions Research Center too was the population that made up these studies. So people of color, as you can see here, actually made up over 66% of the experimental population. However, during this time, from the 1940s to about the 1980s, people of color only made up about 14% of the total population in Lexington, Kentucky. So I think right off the bat, we can sort of see that there was a particular population that was targeted, but there's even more to that, right? So not only did they target people of color, not only did they also target inpatients who were at this health facility, but the Addictions Research Center also shared a campus with a federal prison. So they were also recruiting people of color from the federal prison who were incarcerated for drug charges to join these drug studies as well. So it was a major site for human experimentation. And between the years 1935 to 1975, the Addictions Research Center actually published over 500 studies. Right, so that's a major amount of studies to be rooted and grounded and exploitative of people, right? Human experimentation. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about the Addictions Research Center, I would encourage you, or I would guide you to a film that's actually available on YouTube. So as you can see in the second picture that we have here, right over here, the Addictions Research Center was actually known by a nickname, and it was actually called the Narcotic Farm, right? So in a sense, they're already telling you what it is that they do and what their experiments are comprised of, right? So they're known as being the Narcotic Farm. So if you're interested in learning a bit more, you can actually look up this film called Inside the Mysterious Narcotic Farm, and it's free and available on YouTube if you'd like to learn more about the Addictions Research Center. So the last point that I'd like to make here is that the Addictions Research Center is actually no longer located or localized in Lexington, Kentucky. And it's because they actually had to go through a bit of rebranding. Right? So, following a nationwide ban on using federal prisoners in research studies, right, because they're a vulnerable population that was finally acknowledged, the Addictions Research Center ended up moving their facility to Baltimore in the late 1970s. And they also renamed themselves. So they are now known as the National Institute on Drug Abuse, also known as NIDA. So I also briefly just wanted to go through some more information about CIA-funded projects, right? This MK Ultra project for some folks who may not know. So the Addictions Research Center was one of more than 80 different places that was used as a testing site or that was used as a testing ground for this MK Ultra project. So essentially, it was a project funded by the government to test the parameters of various psychedelic drugs or just all drugs or whatever drugs that they wanted to test in general. So they were looking for what were the effects? What are the symptoms? What happens at particular dosages? If we give someone a dose of LSD at this particular level of microgram, what is going to happen? So what we kind of believe is that the CIA and this MK Ultra project was looking for a drug that could, in a way, control or deprogram some of the minds of folks. They were testing the parameters of people's psychological threshold by giving them different combinations of drugs at different times. So the CIA, in a way, was looking for drugs that could provide certain effects, such as loss of speech. How did these drugs impact people's sensitivity towards pain? How did they impact their memory? And more intriguingly, how did it influence people's sense of willpower? So I want to bring us to the study that Dr. Williams and Dana Strauss conducted, where they were looking into these studies that were published at the Addictions Research Center. So remember, I shared that they published over 500 studies, right? But Dana Strauss and their colleagues were only able to identify 48 that they were able to get a hold of. So Dana Strauss and their colleagues reviewed available empirical publications that were published by the Addictions Research Center according to current ethical standards. So as they were going through these studies, they were looking for particular variables of interest. And these variables include, okay, what were the race and ethnicity of the participants? Were they a vulnerable population? Like, who were they recruiting specifically? What were the standards for the drug administration? Were they giving the same doses to the same people at the same time? They were also looking to see if there were any forms of informed consent, prior to the studies taking place. And they also recorded any forms of undue influence. So undue influence means, okay, were the participants influenced in any particular way during the study, either positively or negatively? So as I shared, they identified 48 original research articles for their qualitative analysis. And in this qualitative analysis, when they looked at all of these studies, they found, or they highlighted, 3 specific themes that I have here on the bottom. So first, there were major ethical issues because more often than not, there was a lack of informed consent. So participants were often unethically uninformed before being enrolled in these drug trials. So these people were subjected to experiments where they were being given LSD, mescaline, opiates, amphetamines, but they were never consulted about the drugs or the dosages that they were actually being given during these experiments. And then on top of that, imagine not knowing the drugs that you're taking, not knowing the dosages, and then you're in a prison setting, all right, or you're in a hospital setting. So they were also forced to endure what we think and what we believe to be these harrowing, painful environments where they are being administered drug or mind-altering substances. So of course, these environments also were not conducive to their well-being. And on top of that, right, there's something else here. On top of the lack of informed consent, oftentimes these people were targeted because they were a vulnerable population who could also be simultaneously dehumanized during this process where they're looking for the parameters and the symptomologies connected to these drugs and substances. So the second theme that they discovered when they were looking through these 48 research articles, unfortunately, was coercive experimentation. So what this means is that in some studies, participants were coerced by research investigators to continue their treatment, or participants were offered unethical incentives to begin their participation. So in the next slide, I'll go into a bit more detail about how some participants were forced to continue to participate. But one aspect I do want to highlight here is that let's think of the context here, right? So they're recruiting people who are incarcerated for drug charges. So some of the studies actually offered the incentive of providing more drugs or different drugs after the experiment or after their dosing to get these inmates to continue or to begin their participation. So you have people who are already vulnerable, incarcerated for drug charges, possibly meeting criteria for a substance diagnosis themselves, and they're being offered more drugs to continue or to begin their participation in these studies, okay? And the final note here, right, which really highlights that they were being coerced or taken advantage of, was that 100% of the inmates actually agreed to receiving drugs as their incentive. They were actually given the option, would you like a reduced sentence or would you like more drugs as your form of payment? And 100% of the inmates chose more drugs as payment. So with all of that in mind, then you can imagine that the third theme that they found was that they were targeting vulnerable populations. So again, the Addictions Research Center doubled as a hospital, but also shared a campus with a federal prison. So the researchers specifically targeted incarcerated individuals, in essence, because they were already familiar with substance use. And they also thought that these incarcerated individuals were already familiar with the effects of drugs, right? With being in an altered state of consciousness or in a form of intoxication. So they thought, okay, well, if we're going to give them LSD and then the next day we'll give them mescaline, maybe they'll be more familiarized with the feeling. So again, that's targeting vulnerable populations. So overall, just to say once more, there were dangerous dosages, lack of informed consent, coercive methods, and overall inadequate oversight in these studies. So just to go a bit more in detail about more findings here. So there are two other things that I want to share. Number one, there was high-risk dosing found in many of these studies. So these researchers were administering dangerously high, frequent, or prolonged doses of psychedelics, sometimes chronically or in rapid succession to each other to test tolerance limits. So in one study, this Isbell et al. Study published in 1956, the researchers were differential in their approach to how they were dosing their participants. So essentially, they actually ended up dosing Black participants with 180 micrograms of LSD for up to 85 days. Right? So they would kind of work their way up to 180 micrograms, and they did this over the course of 85 days. But compare this to the white participants in this study, who actually only received up to 75 micrograms for up to 8 days. Right? That's almost double the dosing that they were giving to Black participants specifically. And even by today's standards, we know that there are adverse effects when we dose 200 micrograms of LSD, right? So they were really testing tolerance limits here. So the second thing that I want to talk about, another finding was differential treatment. So the researchers found evidence, or they'll say that evidence suggests that Black participants were sometimes subjected to harsher conditions, including significantly higher doses, longer drug administration periods, as I just shared, compared to white participants. So in this Isbell et al. Article, I want to bring us back to it. There was actually one Black participant who was deliberately singled out for more hazardous, prolonged, and higher doses of LSD. And the researchers, in their language, framed this as, oh, well, this participant had a very severe reaction to a high dose. And that's why they said that they wanted to drop out of the study. But really, the researchers were practicing differential treatment. So one Black participant in this study said that they wanted to drop out, but then the researchers, in a way, persuaded or coerced them to continue. So even though the participant said, I don't want to do this anymore, 180 micrograms, like that was too high, they persuaded this participant to essentially receive 180 micrograms again over the course of 3 weeks of chronic intoxication. Another thing I want to point out here in terms of differential treatment is the mindset that the researchers were in, right? So how could you be a researcher and be so detached from someone saying, no, I don't want to do this anymore? But because you value the data and you value the outcome so much, you actually ignore that. So there was this form of researcher detachment that was prevalent in these studies. And in one in particular, right, this Monroe study published, Monroe and their colleagues, published in 1957, the researchers in their write-up actually validated their own practices or their own sense of detachment. So these researchers actually described one Black participant being of low intelligence, thereby justifying their heinous behavior. And this heinous behavior was, excuse me, it gets me choked up a little bit. But this heinous behavior is no joke, right? So in this study, they ended up actually tying one Black participant down during their LSD administration because they were begging for relief. But because they validated their own perspective, these researchers, they said, well, this person is of low intelligence, like, they may not fully know what they're talking about. So they continued the drug administration. And they actually subjected this participant specifically to the highest and most dangerous combination of psychedelic drugs. There are two other examples that I'd like to share here regarding differential treatment before I hand things over to Sheldomar. But interestingly, we may look back at these studies and look back at this time period and think, okay, maybe they didn't know about set and setting. Maybe they were just, running these experiments and they were just kind of trying to do the best that they could. Well, I think that that may be woefully naive. I say respectively. And I also say that as evidenced by this Abramson article published in 1980. So in this research study, Abramson was administering and testing the parameters of LSD once more. And he actually had a mixed research participant group. right? So we had some participants who were Black inmates, some participants who were inmates who were also white. And interestingly, both of them ended up complaining that they were feeling uncomfortable being administered LSD in a prison setting. It was making them very uncomfortable. They were feeling a lot of anxiety. But this researcher actually only considered the perspective of the white participants, and he ended up displacing their LSD administration to his very home. So he left the Black participants to be given LSD at the prison, while, as I said, displacing or moving the white participants to his home so that he could reduce their anxiety while they were being given LSD. So again, I don't think that we can certainly say like they didn't know what they were doing, or perhaps it was just of the times. There were inclinations here towards mindset, or I'll say set and setting, but those considerations were differential, and the treatment was only provided, or those considerations for treatment were only provided to the white participants. So the last thing that I want to mention here is the Cholden article published by Cholden and their colleagues in 1955. And I'll be very quick with this because I know that we have been focusing on race and ethnicity, but there were other vulnerable populations who were the inmates. So in their article, Cholden et al. Were also looking at the effects of LSD on inpatient females who were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And they also, unfortunately, had this researcher detachment where they were literally just observing these female inpatients. And they were taking notes of their toilet habits as well as their eroticism habits. So, really crossing over not only ethical boundaries, but personal boundaries and really invading people's privacy. So I bring us here to the final point, right? We were only, or Dana, right, and their colleagues were only looking into 48 studies. And remember that the Addictions Research Center published over 500 studies. Okay, so this calls into question what is the legacy of the Addictions Research Center and these studies that they published. So I'll hand it over to Sheldomar here.
Thank you, Lianna. So I think it's important that we put things into context, and I'm mindful that, we're doing a presentation here at MAPS Canada, and this research took place in the States. But as Lianna said, the MK Ultra project happened across 80 different institutions, which also spanned into Canada and across the States. And the most notable of those took place at the McGill University Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. And between 1957 to 1964, these MK Ultra projects were also taking place under the name Sub-Project 68, which was led by a Scottish psychiatrist, Dr. Donald Irwin Cameron. And a lot of the funding came through from different organizations that were basically fraud, some like the Human Ecology Fund and et cetera, in order to run these procedures on non-consenting psychiatric patients, many of them who were dealing with depression and schizophrenia. And similarly to what Lianna was sharing, these experiments involved prolonged drug-induced comas. They also used electroconvulsive therapy, forced sensory deprivation, and the constant and repeated use of LSD, along with audio loops, all intended to erase and de-pattern the memories of people's minds in an attempt to create a mind control drug. And similarly to what happened at the Addiction Research Center, these experiments did not take into consideration informed consents, and it's very difficult to know the extent of what actually happened, because in 1973, the director of the CIA at the time took it upon himself to destroy many of the records, which are now sort of scattered records here and there to sort of cover up exactly what happened. And it's challenging to know the exact number of victims. It's believed that there is at least dozens of patients and possibly hundreds who are exposed to these extreme protocols. And hundreds of survivors and their families have sought recognition and compensation from suffering lifelong harm, including amnesia, loss of basic self-care skills, emotional instability, and in many cases being reduced to childlike mental states. And in 1992, more than 300 individuals applied for a federal compensation, and there was a class action settlement in the US which awarded $67,000 to each of these folks in 1988. And in Canada, only 77 individuals received compensation in 1992, although a lot of this was signed away through non-disclosure agreements. And to date, neither the CIA nor the Canadian government have issued formal apologies for their roles in these experiments. Next slide. So I think it's important, to recognize, like, yes, these things happened in the past, but how are they showing up today? And the families and survivors of these experiments that took place in Montreal are currently putting forth a class action lawsuit and are trying to revive that and keeping that going. However, Quebec's Court of Appeal has ruled a unanimous decision that the US government has immunity under Canada's 1982 State Act, which can be applied retroactively. So this is causing a lot of challenges in pushing forward with this class action lawsuit. But there's currently up to 300 families who are pushing for the Supreme Court of Canada to recognize this injustice and join the lawsuit if it becomes authorized. There's been really recent news and media around this. So I'm sure if you take a quick Google search, you'll find some coverage that's been happening with a lot of these concerns being brought to light. I think importantly, though, MK Ultra also is in line with the ongoing challenges of colonialism in this country that we call Canada, but across Turtle Island, respectively. And in 2022, a group of Mohawk mothers have from Kanawaki spent 2 years seeking to halt construction at the former Royal Victoria Hospital and Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, as they fear that the site has unmarked graves of Indigenous children who vanished during these times of the MK Ultra projects from the 50s into the 60s. And they insisted on representing themselves in courts and sort of were getting paid off to sort of stop talking about this, but insisted on bringing this justice to light. And although they weren't able to find any human remains at the moment, they are accusing McGill and the Quebec agency, who have breached their agreement to end the search prematurely and sort of overseeing it internally. So these mothers are still continuing the fight for truth and accountability and are doing what they can to bring justice to these atrocities and prevent history from repeating itself. Next slide. So this is sort of where we step in. As a group of Black researchers in the field of psychedelics, we're trying to raise the voice of our community and shine a light on the vast history of exploitation and abuse that had happened to Black communities in Lexington, but across the states, really, for the purpose of scientific investigation, but really to push this field of psychedelic science forward in an equitable and just way. Next slide. So this is the research team. It is being led by Dr. Monica Williams, who Lianna has briefly mentioned or spoken about, but she is the Canada Research Chair in Mental Health Disparities. She's also a professor in the Clinical Psychology program at the University of Ottawa and leads the Lab for Culture and Mental Health Disparities, where Lianna and I are both research assistants in. We're also working alongside Dr. Dorette Johnson, who you can see on the screen here. She is a mental health advocate, a therapist, and really a pillar in her community for leading educational events on mental health, but also spearheading community conversations as a radio talk show host in Louisville, Kentucky. And we're also joined by Sarah Reed, supporting this project as a consultant, who's also a therapist and a psychedelic researcher and a Kentucky native herself. Next slide. So the central purpose of the study really is to gain a comprehensive understanding of the consequences that stemmed from those experiments that took place during that first wave of psychedelic research at the Addiction Research Center, and how these abuses have impacted the victims, their descendants, and the wider communities of color in Lexington. Next slide. So you may be wondering, how are we going to do this? And that's a fair question. Well, by having presentations like this, by developing culturally relevant flyers and materials that can be shared online and in person, by connecting with community stakeholders, community leaders, and organizations in Lexington, virtually and in person, the use of social media and other images, actual media organizations like local news and radio shows. We're doing what we can to invite people to come who may be eligible to participate in our listening circles. And really the aim of these circles is to create a space that's dedicated for members of the Black community in Lexington who have been personally, familially, or communally impacted by the abuse of drug studies that took place at the Addiction Research Center. Now, these sessions, which had already started, are designed to sort of be focus group discussions. So they're kept with about 5 to 10 people at a time to foster a more intimate setting, which may be conducive to sharing possibly sensitive materials and experiences. And each session is being no longer than 90 minutes at a time, just to be respectful and mindful of people's time. As you saw, we have a quite diverse research team, and it's really important that we've all been trained in anti-racism and cultural competency to ensure that we're equipped to navigate the complex discussions around race and trauma and historical injustice with sensitivity and awareness. To uphold accessibility, it's important that we maximize the ease of access for participants. So for the in-person sessions that had already started, they took place at the Peach Cobbler Factory, which is a local Black-owned bakery in Lexington, and folks really enjoyed coming out there. The other sessions took place at the library, one of many libraries in Lexington, again, just as a way to minimize travel burdens for folks traveling to these sessions. And in order to value time and the experience of people and their lived experience and what they're sharing with us, we have compensated everyone, or continuing to compensate everybody $75 for completing sessions. And even if they choose to step away earlier, still offering them their compensation in recognition of their time. Also mindful that life happens and there might be other incurred costs associated with participating in these focus groups. So if there are any challenges with childcare or travel or anything else that might act as a barrier for participation, we've also been supporting with compensation that way too. Food is a big one. At the Peach Cobbler Factory, folks are receiving peach cobbler and just ensuring that food is available as a way to just make the space feel more welcome and inviting for people to be in. And, it's important that we recognize that it will be and has been, talking and discussing about very traumatic experiences can be very difficult for many of us and bring about painful memories and feelings that may surface when having these conversations. So we're doing what we can to go past just offering resources to folks and really offer them therapy if they would like. So for participants who choose to do this, they can be set up with our community partner to do therapy after the fact and really discuss anything that may have come up during those sessions, whether it was related specifically to the abusers or just their experiences that may surface talking about what they did. And also inviting folks who might want to share more or feel a bit more comfortable outside of a group setting to do one-on-one interviews with us as a way to be able to share in a way that's easy and safe for them. Next slide. So we have a few purposes that we're trying to achieve here. And that main aim really, and Lianna sort of has already mentioned it, but we need to understand and record the details of what truly happened during these research abuses, directly from the point of the view of those who were affected, either personally or vicariously through family and community. And really, it's important for us to understand the impact that it's had on these individuals and communities, and whether that's exploring potential psychological, emotional, social, and perhaps intergenerational consequences. This is important for understanding how race-based trauma shows up today and PTSD in this specific context. And moreover, it's really important that we understand how these individuals and communities believe that the products of these original unethical research, which includes the data, the findings, and the publications, should be handled or addressed today. As Lianna mentioned, there was over 500 publications recorded and published from those experiments that took place at the Addiction Research Center. So it's important that we get community input on what should be done with those tainted research legacies, and hear from them what does justice look like in that way. And on the theme of justice, what does it's important for us to understand, like, what does reparations look like for those harms that were caused by those historical research abuses, and how can we gain community perspectives on what does meaningful redress really look like in this case. Next slide. So through all of this, we're hoping that we can foster validation by centering their experiences and acknowledge the injustice and sort of begin paving a path forward for individual and collective healing in a way toward restorative justice. And by documenting these obstacles directly from community voices, it can help to reveal how past ethical violations continue to shape current mental health disparities. And these findings can help researchers and clinicians and policymakers to develop targeted strategies that authentically address these barriers and begin rebuilding broken trust. And not only that, though, but help to develop more inclusive methodologies and accessible, culturally relevant mental health services. Lastly, these findings are ideally going to become a vital blueprint as we think about what the psychedelic science space and field or field is moving and how it's evolving. And by amplifying these voices, this work helps to compel the new wave of psychedelic science to adopt truly equitable approaches to ensure that past mistakes lead to meaningful systemic change rather than repetition. And this community-informed model can be applied not just to this field of research, but across multiple fields in research ethics. Next slide. So in terms of next steps and where we're at, you've probably caught it, but we actually just recently got back from Lexington, Kentucky. So we started our in-person outreach and connection with community and focus groups, which went really well. And currently we are continuing virtual listening circles into July and into August. So we invite folks who are here and who may watch this video afterward. If you would like to collaborate and support us, you can do that through this QR code here. Really, any way that you can support is helpful. And whether that's through sponsorship and of research expenses, or partner to support our outreach efforts and our promotional materials, or offer any other needs that the community may require, whether that's donations, goods, and services. All of that is much appreciated. And I know it's unlikely since we're here in Canada, but if you happen to know someone who would like to participate and is eligible to join the study, they can sign up joining through this form, but more specifically on our website. I'll pass it back to you, Lianna.
All right, everyone. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. And even though it's the end of the presentation, we're going to open up the conversation. So Sheldomar and I call this part, can we talk? Like, can we be real with each other? So we have a couple of questions for the group just to facilitate and to kick things off. And I'll end up copying these and putting them in the chat. But number one, Sheldamar and I have shared a lot of information, and that information can bring up a lot of emotions, right? We described the research as unethical, harrowing, unjust, and maybe even disturbed, right? And all of those emotions that may come up, they're valid, right? And we're open to discussing what your reactions are. So, what are your reactions to what we have shared? Number one. And then number two, what do you know about the MK Ultra projects? Like, have you heard about these research projects that happen that we're referencing specifically, or are there others that you have heard of? Because it seems like there's a bit of hidden history that's happening here that Sheldamar and I are highlighting. And then number three, what are your thoughts about data from these studies still being used today? So I will stop sharing. Thank you everybody for your time and for your attention. So I'll stop sharing, and I will also put these questions in the chat box. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation. It was really informative and very well thought out.
Thank you.
Thanks, Akanksha.
Well, I guess I can start the discussion. I actually learned a bit about MK Ultra studies during some of my psychology classes at UBC that I took. So I haven't heard about the exact studies in Kentucky, but some of the studies that were happening in McGill, I did learn about during my time at UBC. So I wasn't aware that it was so widespread and the studies were taking place in so many different areas and centers because when we were taught it, it was very focused on McGill and the research that was happening there. So that was a little shocking for me. And I did read the paper that you guys sent prior to our research room. So looking at the statistics of the disparity between white and black people and the number of incarcerated people that were being studied, that was also quite a large number.
Yeah, totally. I'll just chime in there for a moment. It makes me think about, and like I mentioned, the CIA director, whether being instructed or taking it upon himself to destroy the records. Like McGill is like that one place that most in Canada are familiar that that's where the MK Ultra project took place. But similarly, how they were able to hide what happened in Lexington and many of these other institutions, it makes me wonder, like, where else in Canada specifically did these experiments take place? Could be right under our nose, like we may not know, but it's quite yeah, it's scary to think about, and just recognizing those impacts that are still affecting people here and in the States today. Um, yeah, it's quite disgusting, to be honest.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like it's very surprising too. Like, I remember when Childemar and I kind of got the ball rolling on this project, it was around Bicycle Day, and it's just like, I feel like a lot of times when we're celebrating these psychedelic holidays, or even when we're thinking about where psychedelics as an industry is moving to this day, like we don't look much at the history of how we even got to the place that we're at right now. And I think that, a lot of people, unfortunately were like taken advantage of, during that time. And I don't think we even really know the half of it, of what really happened. So I think it's important for us to think, and like from your comment as well, Akanksha, how do we not repeat history? So that if we are considering this as, a psychedelic renaissance, how can we make sure that it's not supporting only certain people while uplifting others who are just more, or who are larger conglomerates in the psychedelic industry? So I think you bring up great points there. Like there was differential treatment, and how can we make sure that we're not repeating that? Arseni, please.
Yeah, just because you're talking about the different treatments for different groups, and that's an important point because I'm realizing right now that with psychedelics, what's happening, usually it's done with a psychologist. So when you have like a special space, and psychedelics usually take time as well. So now you have to have a specialist who's going to be there for hours on end to like supervise you. And now you have to be able to pay for this. But to pay for this is not just already a psychologist for an hour would cost you like $100 to $200. Now it's like 5 to 6 hours, and it's only people who would be able to afford it now can actually have these treatments. So that's a very important question. How can we make it available for everybody, for people who don't have these resources to pay someone for like 6 7 hours for a specialist? So I think this is a very interesting point, and how you brought up the project MK Ultra. That's I heard about this project. It's very interesting, and how it just sickening how people decide, oh, we're gonna control someone's mind, and let's just put a bunch of drugs and try to figure out how to control someone. So yeah, no, just thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. It's just more of a comment. I don't know if it's like there is a question in it. Oh, maybe yeah, this is a small question. So you mentioned 50 studies, over 500. So what happened with the other 450 studies? I kind of missed that.
Mhm.
That was also a question I had.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's kind of up in the air. Like that's all that Dana and Dana and Dr. Williams were able to find. But I think with Sheldomar bringing up that sometimes the records are just destroyed, or it takes, or like, you have to like request the information,
Yeah.
So if we understand that these centers kind of go through rebranding or revamping, it can be difficult to try to exactly target like where are the rest of these studies. But I think that's a great point because we would certainly love to get our hands on them or to get a hold of them, right? Because 500 is a huge number. So, so yeah, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Sheldamar.
Oh yeah. I appreciate the question, Arseny. And I think you raised some important parts around what does access look like in a more equitable way. But at the same time, it's challenging, and sort of how Lianna like started with the presentation, like with Dr. Williams going down there in 2019 to start those workshops and recognizing like, hey, there's some people who should be in this room who are not in this room. It's deeper than just like being able to afford these things. It's like, how do we challenge that mistrust and the impacts that these sort of histories leave on communities? And if they don't feel safe, with research or mental health just generally outside of psychedelics, how can we expect them to want to participate in psychedelic research, or psychedelic therapies, broadly speaking? So there's a lot that, yeah, needs to happen in order to rebuild that trust and foster relationships that they see themselves and be like, you know what, I see themselves in that research or in that space. Yeah, hence why we're trying to basically have those kind of stories come to light and yeah, see what folks want from that.
Yeah. I think the last comments I'll make too, from your question, Arseni, is it's interesting, like what you're bringing up with accessibility is like the particular people who are exploited are the ones who can't access it now. Right. So it's like you would think that there would be a streamline, like, okay, this have impacted your community, your family, or we all know about intergenerational trauma and how that can get passed down as well. Right. And so I think you bring up a great point. Like, so that actually increases the need for us to target accessibility for these communities specifically. And bringing us back to some of the research that Dr. Williams does on racial trauma, there has also been previous research that is suggesting that psychedelics can help people process and work through their experiences of racial trauma. So it's like there's this interesting push and pull between there's mistrust in the community, but also as well, psychedelics have been shown to also help people to process and work through the intergenerational trauma that could be a byproduct from these studies. So there's like an interesting tug of war that's happening there that we're seeing as well. So thank you.
If I can add something that's interesting for me is I'm currently located in Australia, and to my knowledge, there wasn't any psychedelic studies or injustices in psychedelic research here, but there have been many other forms of injustices in research and like medicine, for example. But the approach that Australia has taken compared to Canada is quite different. And when I initially went to Canada, I was quite surprised that, for example, like not a lot of people knew about the stolen generation or residential schools, or even like Black history in Canada. But that's something that we learn in our schools in Australia every single year, like every semester. That was something that was taught to us. And then same with when I was doing my undergrad at UBC, a lot of the case studies that were being used for like reparations or methods of reparations were actually from Australia. And I think they've done a relatively better job with like introducing like Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous leadership into all kinds of research, including like Alzheimer's research, research in medicine. And that's something that's really taken into consideration. And Australia is not like the best example either. Like there's still a lot more that can be done. But I think in terms of your questions of like the data still being used in the studies, and it seems that there's not really a large focus on using Indigenous or Black perspectives in informing the research other than what your group is doing, and as beyond that informing government policy and how that shapes research. So I think that's definitely something that can be taken into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. It's I know Australia and New Zealand are not the same, but I was reading this paper recently about the indigenous people in New Zealand. I think the Maori. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but getting their perspectives on psilocybin assisted therapy for end of life care. And that was a really fascinating article for me to read because I've never heard those perspectives, let alone those types of perspectives here in Canada or really in the States. Like only now they're starting to come around. So you might be onto something there, Akanksha, in terms of like how different places and yeah, deal or acknowledge their history and try to do right by it.
Mhm.
Yeah, Canada is something. I'll leave it there.
So it looks like Sheldamar and I are now traveling to the States, Canada, Australia, and New
Australia.
Zealand. Hopefully.
You can come visit me if you're in Australia. I think I'll be here for the next little while.
Hey, road
Okay.
trip. I like
Sounds
it. I
good.
like
Are there any other questions that came up during the presentation, Asani or Kat? Well, I guess if no one has anything
I
else
do
to
have a
add,
quick.
then oh yeah.
Yeah, I thank you so much for this presentation. This was great. I like did a really deep dive around like 2022, 2023, and I'd stepped away from the space for a while. So this was like a really wonderful like reconnection.
Mm,
Um, and I think you make really good points about the fact that like Canada, like the knowledge in Canada of these kind of things seems to be quite low in general. Um, and there's a like a psychedelic summit that happens in Hollyhock. I don't know
yeah,
if you've heard about,
heard about
which in this first year was kind of like this like psychedelic like ethics and equity space. Um, but like two of the founders of Hollyhock are like two of the biggest sexual abusers in psychedelic history in Canada. And
it.
so at first I was like, oh, is this kind of like a re like a rebalancing of history? Like this is like a way of like of that terrible legacy like being like finally like brought to light. But I've spoken to so many people about it and no one seems to
Mm.
be aware of that fact. And when I spoke to one of the people that worked at Hollyhock, she was also surprised and she was like, well, we're not connected with Richard Jensen anymore. And I was like, well, like Rick and Grassy is like still on your website. Like it's
Mm,
things that they should know, but like don't know. And that's even, yeah, even going beyond like any kind of like racial inequities, any kind of like indigenous abuses that have happened, like even very simple and very recent stuff,
Mm.
I think is like not really spoken about, not really known about. And
Mm.
so I was so happy to see this talk, and I'm so happy that you're
Thank
kind of
you.
putting this out there, and hopefully
I
that starts to shift.
yeah.
Thank you so much. I did not know that. And I think what you bring up there is this point that these abuses that happened, right? The wheel is still turning. Right? Like that's very recent. And then the wheel continues to turn when these abuses end up being overshadowed by maybe somebody's status or their contributions to the field of psychedelics or to, what have you, whatever role it is that they play. But, I think one of our calls to action here, and I think what you shared, Kat, as well, is for us to really start to look at deeper layers, right? Of how people's egos are influenced, or how people are representing their egos in this field of psychedelics where we try to be very warm and welcoming to so many people. But really, sometimes people are still bringing their own selves and their own character into this space. So we need to kind of make sure we're peeling away more layers than just looking at the surface level at times. And I think in the psychedelic industry, sometimes we're a bit guilty of bypassing or just looking at that initial superficial level, instead of looking deeper. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
And I think sometimes people get a bit defensive and like make it about themselves or like a question on themselves rather than looking beyond that as something greater and something that affects a different demographic.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah,
Well,
I was trying to talk to Maps Canada about this because Maps Canada did some of these research pieces. So like it's fascinating um, to talk about it in this space. And I think it's, yeah, hopefully the beginning of a lot more openness in this space. It's nice. It's been nice for me to see kind of like Maps Canada shift. And so, yeah, I'm grateful and excited about the future.
Yeah, that's real. You know, without acknowledging these harms, whether recent or in the history, like things will just repeat, right? And harm will continue and reproduce itself. So it's essential that we center justice and equity in the ways that we do it, but also be honest about it and not take it personal, like you mentioned, Akanksha. And like, if we're serious about this work and trying to bring about healing in a certain way, then we need to really be serious about what's on the underbelly of everything.
Yeah. All right. And I think so just in the chat here, thank you, Akanksha, for sharing a lot of our information. We have our social media and promotional links. So we have our website, our Instagram, which is just at Building a History. You can follow us for updates. We have infographics, pictures about our time when we were in Lexington, which again was beautiful. We have our personal Instagrams here, or our professional Instagrams here, I'll say. And then our emails if you want to get in touch with Sheldamar and I. So feel free to be in touch with us. We would love to continue the conversation. And, I guess we'll just say thank you again for Maps Canada for hosting us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for presenting. There's a lot that we all learned, and hopefully the people that watch the recordings also learn a lot from this. And I think Kat is right that this is a start of looking at the history from a different perspective and learning from it. I will just ask, since this video is being recorded, are there any sections that people would want cut out of the final recording, or is everyone happy with everything that's being recorded?
I mean, I hadn't expected to talk on this presentation at all, but I stand by what I said. So please keep it in.
Yeah, keep it in. Yeah, I'm good with everything.
Me as well, yeah. And we would love the recording too, so we can promote it as well.
Yeah, I'll send you a link once the recording is processed in the cloud as well. And usually we also upload to the YouTube. So if you want to share it within your circle or within your LinkedIn as well, then we can get the word out there better, because this was a very insightful presentation and I'm hoping that a lot more people are able to engage with it.
Agreed.
Thank you.
So just for administrative reasons, I do have to share a final slide. And then I'll let everyone go. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, thank you once again, Sheldamar and Lianna, and everyone for coming today and engaging in the discussion. I think this is a great way to, I think the prompts that you guys gave was a very good way of starting the discussion. So we will not be hosting a research room session next month. Our next session will be September 18th with Joel Adams, and that will be on psychedelics and spirituality. So I'll send Sheldamar and Lianna, both of you, an email about it as well, because you are welcome to join any future research room sessions for free. So we can discuss more about that later. And please join our mailing list to get updates of when registration is open and about all our other initiatives. We have started sending specific research room emails. So if people join the mailing list, then they'll be able to get updates on when next sessions and future sessions are. And you can also visit our webpage for the recording of today's session and past ones. I'll also be emailing the attendees a link to that. And if Sheldamar and Lianna, you're both okay with it, maybe the slides of the presentation. And feel free to email if you want to present, or again, when you have further research, or if there's anyone else that you know who would want to present. We really appreciate everyone's attendance by donation for today's event. And please consider making a further donation to MAPS Canada's General Fund to support all our initiatives to expand safe, legal, and equitable access to psychedelics.